English. Okay, hey, I'm glad that you're here this morning. That's totally on me. That's my bad. Hey, so we've been in this series, #Goals, and we're wrapping that up today. We've talked about everything from friendships and dating to family relationships, and then last week, our relationship with Jesus Christ. And so this morning, as we wrap it up, we need to do something to get started. You're gonna have to talk to your neighbor, so scoot over or whatever the deal is, or turn around with that. There's two questions. The first question is this. So last week, we saw like 60 people get baptized, which was super great. So you guys get to be the people in charge. What is the top three things that those people who just got baptized need to be focusing on, okay? Top three things, you no more than that. You only have 23 seconds, so don't think about it. Top three things that people that just got baptized need to do. Ready, go. All right, I'm gonna cut you off there real quick. Second question, it might seem somewhat unrelated, but we'll draw it together later. When I say the word kingdom, what do you think of? 20 seconds. All right. Here's the deal. If you're anything like me and the people that I talked to this week, when you think about what are the most important things, the top three things that people who just got baptized need to be doing, you probably said something along the following. They need to learn how to read the Bible. They need to learn how to pray. They need to get plugged into church, come on a regular basis. They need to get into a small group. All these different things that people are supposed to be doing, and those are all great answers, but that's more than likely what you're talking about. And then when you said kingdom, I'd be interested to hear about that. Most people said something along the lines of like some sort of a movie or a book or something like this. Maybe there's a video game or something you guys are playing, I don't know, whatever's going on there. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. If we're real honest with ourselves, a lot of us, if you're like me, I love goals. I think goals are really valuable. And whenever I set goals, I'm setting goals because I'm over here and I want to get to over here. And so when I set goals, I'll set SMART goals. You know, they're simple, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and they're time sensitive. And I love them because if I can just execute those goals, I'll be able to accomplish my objective. I'll be able to change or start or stop a habit. Or I'll be able to learn a new skill or a new piece of knowledge, whatever the deal is. I like goals for that reason. But if I'm really honest with myself and if I'm really honest with you, one of the things that I like the most about goals is it puts me in charge. It puts me in charge because I'm going from here to there, and it has to do with how well I can do something, my discipline, my self-control, my ability to follow a plan or a formula to get from A to B. And the challenge is sometimes we like being in charge so much, and we like that ability. We'll do that same thing with relationships, and worst of all with our relationship with Jesus. And so we'll get to a place where we think, or we just make following Jesus into a formula, where if I will just do all of these right things, maybe some of the good answers that you gave to what those new believers need to do, read the Bible more, pray more, all this kind of stuff, you begin to have this formula. If we just do these things, then we'll go from here to here. And if I'm honest, it's because I like to be in control and take things my way. And so this morning, we're going to talk about a statement that Jesus made where he starts to talk about the kingdom, which is why I asked the second question. What do you think of when you think of a kingdom? So if you're doing the fill in the blank thing, you got a little piece of paper in your bulletins you can fill out. Or if you're not, if you're like me, you don't care about that stuff, just kind of keep on rolling with me. That's great. So first of all, we need to define what a kingdom is. And here's what a kingdom is. A kingdom is where the king is in charge. A kingdom is where the king is in charge. So like for me, when I answer that question, I think of like Disney movies and stuff, because there's always like a king and a magical kingdom and all this stuff going on. But a kingdom is where the king is in charge because what he says goes. Like if he wants to do something good for someone, he says it, it happens. If he wants off with someone's head, off with their head. A kingdom is where the king is in charge. And today we're going to look at a one-line story, they call it a parable that Jesus said, and he's talking about the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven is not something that we talk about every day. And so I wanted to establish that a kingdom is where the king is in charge. And more importantly for today, the kingdom of heaven is where Jesus is in charge. So the kingdom of heaven is where Jesus is in charge. That's the second thing on your fill in the blank deal. The kingdom of heaven is where Jesus is in charge. And so if you've got a Bible or if you've got the piece of paper, it's on the screens or device with scripture, flip over to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew 13 verse 33. Before we go there and read it, I want to set it up for you a little bit. So here's what's happening. Starting in Matthew chapter 12, it's a Saturday. And so for the Jews, Saturday was a big deal. It was a day you're supposed to take for rest. And the whole idea was you could work and pursue your goals for 6 days. On the seventh day, you rested and you acknowledged that it was God's kingdom, that he's the boss, he's in charge. And so you kick back and relax and let him be the one who's ultimately in charge of everything. And so Jesus and his guys are walking through a grain field and they're hungry. So they start picking kernels of wheat off and they start eating them. And the religious guys are getting really hacked off. It's like, that's against the rules. You can't do that. And then Jesus goes to a place called the synagogue, which is a building in neighborhoods where they would read the Jewish scriptures, and then someone would kind of talk about them, kind of like we do here at church. And Jesus did this every Saturday, so he was doing that. And he saw a guy who was crippled and his arm was shriveled up like this, and they get into a debate. And he understood that the religious guys were upset because Jesus and his guys are breaking the rules. And he's like, what's going on? So he's like, brings this guy up and he heals him and his arm's better. And some people are amazed, some people are mad. He's like, what is going on? So Jesus gets fed up. He's like, I'm out of here. So he leaves, he goes out to the next place, and he starts to tell all these parables, all these stories. And they're always about the kingdom of heaven. So remember, a kingdom is where the king is in charge, and the kingdom of heaven is where Jesus is in charge. And he starts to talk about all these things. The first one is about a farmer who plants seed, and he throws it, and there's 4 kinds of field. One, some of it grows, some of it doesn't grow, some of it grows for a little bit, and then it dies, and all this kind of stuff. And he starts talking about the kingdom of heaven. Then he tells another parable. And it's about a farmer who had a field, and he sows a bunch of wheat. And then someone else, his enemy, comes down and puts a bunch of weeds in his field. And he's like, I'll show that guy. And so then the wheat and the weeds are growing together. And again, just like, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And then he comes to today's, and this is Matthew 13:33. And so here, it's in your paper. It'll be on the screen. Here's what it said. I'm going to read out of my Bible. Here's what it says. Jesus is talking. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and worked into 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. So here's the deal. When you and I want bread, we go to the grocery store, we buy a bag of bread, and we go home and we eat it. These guys in their culture, they didn't have that, and so they would all either knew someone or knew how to make it themselves, and that whole deal. And so they just knew this is how you make bread. You take some flour, you put some leaven or yeast in it. The yeast is somehow alive and active, and it makes the bread rise, and then you cook it, and it comes out, and it's fun to eat. And so everybody eats bread. Everybody knew that. However, they also knew, like, when you made bread, you just made enough that you're going to eat, like, at that meal or in the next couple of hours because you didn't want the bread to get yucky because they didn't have plastic bags, preservatives, all that kind of stuff. So they all knew that. And so Jesus comes out and talks about 3 measures of flour. That's like 50 pounds of flour. So people are hearing this and like, this is crazy. And so here's what we're going to talk about today. The kingdom of heaven, it grows in such a way that is unbelievable. And so people would hear this like, that's unbelievable. Why would anybody take 50 pounds of flour and take the usual amount of yeast and put it in there and wait that long for it to get ready, and then they make all this bread? It's unbelievable. Why would anybody do that? So it's a kind of an unbelievable story. Why would that happen? My friend Colin and I, who's the outreach pastor, we went and talked to a guy named Kendall McFall. This week he's here in town and he works with bread, and so he's explaining to us the ratio in modern days is 2%. So if you have 100 grams of flour, you would work in 2 grams of yeast, and it's dry yeast, dry flour, you put them together, put water in there, and it activates everything and it starts to rise and they cook it. Now when that's happening, what's happening is the yeast, once it's activated with water, it begins to feed on the sugars and stuff that is in the flour, and so 2 things begin as a byproduct. There's alcohol and then there's CO2. The alcohol is burned off when we cook it. The CO2 creates the bubbles and the air pockets and that kind of thing, and that's what causes the bread to rise, and we like it. That's what gives it its texture and the thing that we like about it, okay? And so that's how bread works. So the first thing is the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, and it's unbelievable. The second thing is it's unexplainable. We know about yeast, and we know that yeast is like a single cell fungus that grows and lives. They didn't know that. They just knew like somehow this thing is alive. And so the way they would do it is they would make a batch of dough, pull off part of it, leave it in a container, and then bake the bread, and then the next time they need to start, they just kept adding that back in, okay? So that was the process they did. They couldn't explain it. They just knew that there was something happening. It was alive, made it rise, makes our bread better, okay? The third thing is it is unmistakable. It is unmistakable. So, in the Jewish culture, they had a holiday called Passover, which just happened recently. It leads up to Easter for us and about that same time of year. And so they have a thing where they eat unleavened bread. If you've never eaten unleavened bread, it's a lot like a saltine cracker. It's just real thin and crispy. And so it was unmistakable, the difference between unleavened bread and leavened bread. So imagine the difference, if you will, between a saltine cracker and a big old loaf of bread that you might get like at Panera or the grocery store, or like the bread at Subway or something like this. It's soft, it's big, and so it's unmistakable, the difference. It's unmistakable which one has leaven and which one doesn't. So Jesus is telling this one-line story, and everybody there is listening to it, and they get it. This is unbelievable. Why would someone do this with this much flour? This is unexplainable. We don't know exactly how it happens, but the yeast, the leaven in there makes the rest of the thing grow, and eventually it spreads through the whole thing, and then we can bake it and eat it. It's just the way we want it. And it is unmistakable, the difference between leaven and unleavened bread. And Jesus is saying that the kingdom of heaven, where he is the king and where he is in charge, is a lot like this. And so in order to illustrate this, in order for us to understand what's happening, we're going to take a look at history. So up here is going to come a timeline, and we're going to talk about some things that happened in history. So you guys are all familiar, whether you know it or not, with the Gregorian calendar. That's the calendars that we use. It was developed several years after Jesus was born, and it puts the 0 there where Jesus was born. Okay, this is where we get BC and AD. So here's what's happening. Between 0 and 30, that's the life of Jesus. Jesus is living for about 30 years. When he's about 30-ish, 33-ish, that's when he had his ministry, and that's when he was crucified and came back to life. That's the story that Barry gave to us last week, the gospel story, the good news of the kingdom of heaven coming, where a God who created us in his image, loves us, wanted a relationship with us, needed to deal with the sin issue, the rebellion issue, so he sent his son. That's him living for 30 years. He dies on the cross. He's dead, and then 3 days later, he's no longer dead. And then that's what's happening. And so after that, after his crucifixion and resurrection, here's Jesus. He's talking with his friends who spent the last 3 years with him. They fell in love with this guy. They trusted him with everything. They were willing to do whatever he said. They saw him. They were expecting one thing from him, and then he did something else. And at the end, Jesus gives them instructions, and he sends them out, and they all go start talking about it. And we're going to come back to that. But they go out, and they start talking about it. So between the circle of 30 and 70, here's what happens. Almost all of what we call the Bible was written in those times. And they're simply just documents of people accounting the things that they saw. Many of the people that wrote were eyewitnesses that had seen Jesus them very selves. And so they're writing all this stuff down and sharing with people. And then what's happening is they're circulating them. And so just think, this is long before paper was readily available, long before the Gutenberg press and all this kind of stuff. And so it was very expensive to have ink, very expensive to have stuff to write on and all these things. And it was painstakingly to copy these things, so they had to do it by hand. It took forever, but they kept doing it because they're like, man, this is great stuff. People got to hear it. So all that's happening between 30 and 70. And then in the year 70 AD, something horrible happened. And at this time, I'd like to pause and make a shameless plug for our reading plans. These are our journal reading plans. You can give it in the lobby at the welcome desk. We ask for a $5 donation, but if you're just going to use it, you can just take one. And here's why I do a shameless plug. I couldn't have planned this. I'm not that smart, and I'm horrible at planning. But on day 6, which would have been yesterday in our reading plan, the first week, we were reading Luke chapter 21, 20 through 28. And here's what's going on. Jesus is standing with his friends and a whole bunch of other people at the temple. So the temple was the big building that was central to the religion of the Jews, okay? So he's standing there, and everyone's like, wow, this place is so great. Look at these beautiful stones and all this kind of woodwork and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, yeah, but you know what? It's all going to fall down soon. And everyone's like, what? And so here's the deal. It had been built. It had been torn down multiple times throughout history. And then Jesus is standing with these guys, and he says, here, it's going to happen again. And in fact, you need to be watching for this because it's going to happen soon. And here's what he says. And not too short of a time, an army led by someone who is not a Jew is going to come, and he's going to encircle the city. And it's going to be a horrible deal. It's going to be a bad deal. So anyone who's in the city needs to run to the mountains. And how bad is it going to be for pregnant women and nursing mothers? It's going to be horrible. Pray that it doesn't happen in the winter. And everyone's like, dude, what's up, Debbie Downer? What's going on? Well, AD 70, so 40 years after he had gone back to heaven, it happened. A guy named Titus is leading the military army. So the Romans had been in occupation of Jerusalem and Israel, and they are fed up with these Jews. Like, these guys are stubborn people. They keep resisting. We've had it. We're going to put them in their place. So Titus brings his army in. They surround the city. They lay it to siege. And as they capture people, here's what they do. They crucify them outside the city. They leave their bodies hanging so that the people inside the city will grow in fear and understand this is what's about to happen to us. So sure enough, people are running for the mountains just like Jesus said they should, and all this bad stuff is happening, and finally the city falls, and they tear down the temple. Just like Jesus said they would. And they take all the remaining people, and if they haven't killed them, they put them into slavery or they run away. And now all of the Jews and all of these people who knew the story of Jesus and were following Jesus are spread all over the world. They call it the diaspora. And then what happens between the fall of the temple and 312, so for 242 years, the Roman Empire has their way with the Christian people. And you've seen movies like Gladiator or other things that are happening where there's these big coliseums and they're having these gladiator battles and these fights, and they throw the Christians to the lions as sport and as game, as entertainment. And people are being enslaved, people are being killed, people are being persecuted left and right. And here's what's amazing. In 312, a guy named Constantine becomes emperor. And the Roman Empire is fractured, and he's a good leader, and he realizes he's got to unify this country, this empire, and he's trying to figure out a way to do it. And you got to remember what Jesus said in this thing. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman worked into 3 measures of bread and 3 measures of flour until the whole loaf of bread was leavened. It's unbelievable. It's unexplainable. And it's unmistakable. Here's what's happening. The most powerful empire on the face of the earth is fractured. And Constantine, the emperor, his mom is a Christian, so he begins to look into this deal, and history will show you that he becomes a Christian not because he's interested in Jesus, because he realizes now the one thing that everybody in his, or the most unifying thing in all of the Roman Empire is the religion of Christianity. How in the world is that possible? That is unbelievable that this ragtag group of people led by an outlier in their society, Jesus, unschooled, ordinary men, blue-collar workers, have followed this guy. He lived with them, walked with them, talked with them, and then he sent them out. They've been persecuted for over 200 years. And now the most powerful nation in the world that still influences governments and in our culture today is turned upside down and realizes this is the one thing that's going to hold us together. That is unbelievable, and that is unexplainable, and it is unmistakable, the lives of these people and the way that they were living, and so much so that Constantine now makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And here's what happens next, is because it's now official and it's recognized and it's legal, people begin to take these documents that they had been hiding in secret and treasuring and reading to each other, and they begin to put them together. So in 350, you have these words, and you don't need to worry about how to pronounce them, but here's what's happening. They're taking they're gathering those documents, and they're putting them together, and then in 388, they call it Ta Biblia, and that's the first time that this group of documents is put together, and they begin to call it the book, or the Bible. So here's why I tell you all this. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman takes and works into 3 measures of flour until the whole batch is leavened. It is unbelievable. It is unexplainable, but it's unmistakable. In this 242-year period, a movement has started and spread like wildfire. These people should have given up, but they didn't. Here's something else I want you to understand. Hear me out on this. If you're on your phone and you're like doing like Pinterest or Facebook or something, could you take a break for just a second? Because I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm about to say. Christianity does not exist because of the Bible. Christianity does not exist because of the Bible. There's 2 reasons that's important. There's 2 groups of people that need to hear why I'm saying that. First of all, there's a group of people that have a hard time believing in Jesus or have given up faith in Jesus because they read or they heard somewhere that there is enough evidence that makes for a shaky argument that the world was actually covered in a flood at one point in time, that there's legitimate evidence or argument that maybe there was no mass exodus of people from Egypt to Israel. And so here's why you need to understand that Christianity doesn't exist because of the Bible. Because the Bible wasn't in here when Christianity was making its greatest strides. And we need to also understand, for people like me who've grown up in the church, if we're not careful, we'll begin to do something that I've done before. So I brought in my biggest, fattest Bible. This is called a Life Application Bible. In addition to just having the Bible in here, there's information about the Bible and about the people that are in there, and it helps us to better understand the context and what was written and when it was written and who was written to and all that kind of stuff. There's an entire industry devoted to Christian literature, Christian books, Bibles and Bible study tips, Christian radio, Christian TV, all this kind of stuff. And none of that is bad. None of that is bad as if it's taken in perspective. Here's the problem. If we're not careful as Christians, sometimes we'll care so much more about knowing about this thing or knowing about Jesus than we do about Jesus. And what's interesting to me is Jesus actually calls people like myself out, people who are in full-time ministry. He stands before them one time and says, look, you guys are so dedicated and so into studying the scriptures because you think that by them you have eternal life. But these scriptures talk about me, and here I am in front of you. And you refuse to come to me. And so if we're not careful as Christians, we'll elevate knowing about the Bible or knowing about Jesus. We'll elevate the kind of services we have on the weekend, or we'll elevate whether or not we're in a life group or some other ministry above the fact of just Jesus Christ. And here's the thing, that stuff wasn't happening here. They didn't know how to read. What happened is people heard the word. They heard the stories, and they believed it, and they began to live like Jesus was telling the truth. They began to live like Jesus was telling the truth. And then a movement of people started. The kingdom of heaven came, and it was like leaven. It was unbelievable. It was unexplainable. And it was unmistakable. They lived like Jesus was telling the truth, because here's what Jesus said: I have come to seek and to save the lost. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, for my yoke is light. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. Jesus said, a new command I give to you, that you love one another. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Wait a minute, Jesus. What about all these rulers of countries that have so much power and such big militaries that they can go anywhere, anytime, and do whatever they want? What about those guys? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. All right, God, but what about these rich people that can buy their way in or out of any situation or any circumstance? They got so much money, they can even buy other people. What about these guys? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. All right, but what about these people, Jesus? What about the people, Jesus, that are so mad when I follow you and do what you say, that they're gonna kill me, or they're gonna tear my family apart, they're gonna take my job away, they're gonna make fun of me, they're gonna ridicule me? What about these people? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, as you go, teach people to obey the very things that you have learned to obey. And I will be with you always. People began to live like Jesus was telling the truth. And there was a movement that started. The kingdom of heaven came like leaven. It was unbelievable. It was unexplainable. But it was unmistakable. So my challenge to you, if you're doing the fill in the blank thing, here's the next fill in the blank, is this. Do whatever it takes to know Christ and to make Christ known. Do whatever it takes to know Christ and to make Christ known. I'll be honest with you, I'm the discipleship minister here, and there are so many times when I get so excited about knowing Jesus, and I want so badly for each and every one of you to know Jesus and to help your friends and your family know Jesus, and I try to figure out how we can do this, and if I'm not careful, I'll become formulaic, and I'll give you a plan. And I'll give you this impression that if you will just read what's in the journal every day and you'll write down certain things, or if you'll come to a life group, if you'll come to CR, if you'll come on the weekend, then you'll be okay. You'll move from here to here. And if you come on the weekends, you'll experience this incredible service. But the reality is, the reason we do all those things is because those are the things that have helped us to know Jesus. And it's just about him. We just want you to know Jesus. And so if some point in your time, in your journey, if you hear me saying something different, or if you hear me saying you have to do this stuff, you're not a good Christian, just know that we're not communicating. Because we just want you to know Jesus, because otherwise what happens is we build this religion that's built on us trying to feel good, and we're building our kingdom where we're setting goals that we can control rather than following and knowing Jesus. One of my favorite Christian authors, his name is Mike Yaconelli. Check out what he says in his book, In Dangerous Winter. As a result of living a way where we're controlling and having our own goals, as a result, we have ended up with a feel-good gospel that attracts thousands, but transforms no one. If the kingdom of heaven is alive in us, if it's moving in this church, it's going to be unbelievable. It's It's going to be unexplainable. It won't be a formula that I can give to you. You do this, this, and this, and you'll get there. But it's going to be unmistakable. Lives will be transformed. And the world will look at us, and they'll see the difference between us and them, just the way that we could see the difference between unleavened and leavened bread. So would you please join me in doing whatever it takes to know Christ and make him known. Jesus, we come this morning and we just want to say that you're real. We believe you. We believe that what you said was true. And would you help us to have the courage to look at our lives and change the things that need to change so that our lives will line up with what you said. Please help us to love you and value you and your presence above everything else in our life. You are so good. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.